In this story that's been developing all week now, in the aftermath of the devastating Johannesburg fire, the Gauteng Health Department has given the families of the victims of that deadly fire, of course, that was in the Johannesburg CBD, 30 days in which to claim the bodies of their loved ones. Some families are expected to go to mortuaries in Diepkloof and Hillbrow today to try to identify their loved ones. The death toll now standing at 76. One of the SABC's reporters who's been on the story for us throughout the week is Hasina Gori, and she joins us live now in studio before she goes out to one of those mortuaries. Hasina, thank you very much indeed for making time. What's the latest? Last we heard, the death toll was standing at 76. Any update there?
Griselda, yes, as you heard yesterday, the Minister of Health telling us that the death toll has risen from 74 now to 76. That number still stands. We told that the building has been handed over to the police. They are now doing their forensics at the moment, and they haven't yet, or they don't expect to find any more. There are still some of those that are in hospital. We know there's almost 250 people that were injured, many for burns, some for smoke inhalation. Many have been released. We've been speaking to them as we meet them, throughout our story. But for now, we don't know if there's any others that may have succumbed to their wounds at the time in hospital. But right now, the death toll still remains at 76.
Hasina, has the building being swept a final time just so that emergency services and police and all the authorities there ensure that there are no remains inside? What do we know there?
So from how respondents happen at emergency service is that the first respondents, who are your firefighters and EMS services, will first go through that building looking for first survivors, and then for those that may be buried under the ashes and timbers of that building, given that that building had many informal settlements within its building. And then that scene was then handed over to police, who then begin the forensic stage of the investigation. And that's where we currently at. We've seen that barbed wire around the building to ensure that no one gets into the building and interferes with any kind of investigation. They've also cautioned residents to not try and go back into the building, as a structural integrity of the building cannot be stated right now. They're also looking for kind of evidence into what exactly led to the fire starting in the early hours of Thursday morning, but also looking into what could have caused it to spread that fast. We know it started on the ground floor, so that's where those sweeps are currently going on. We know a K9 unit was also brought in hopes of finding if there were any remains of people to be brought to ground.
I guess now begins the unenviable task, Hasina, of these families identifying their loved ones who've passed away. That is taking place, I understand, today. You will be at the Diepkloof mortuary, I understand.
So that process started yesterday. We were at the Diepkloof Forensic Pathology Services in Soweto from the early hours of the morning. The mortuary opens at 8 o'clock. When we got there was much confusion and frustration from families, because they were then redirected to the Hillbrow Forensic Services. There they were told they were unable to actually identify their bodies. We got a briefing midday from the Gauteng Health Department giving more clarity and saying that at that stage, 62 of those 74 at that time deceased were burnt beyond recognition. That means there was no way for a family member to open up and just walk into the mortuary and be able to identify their family just from their features, just from a visible recognition.
And I want to get to that, Hasina. I mean, there are those who have been burnt beyond recognition. That on its own has its own process. Talk us through what happens there, because obviously some DNA testing now would need to happen before these families can do anything with regard to laying their loved ones to rest.
And that is where the difficulty then begins, Griselda. We've seen the process, as I said, they can't just walk in and bring in identification of their family member and say, this is the ID of my family member, this is what it would, what he or she would look like, these are the identifiable markers that they may have. Now that DNA process. So what is happening right now is that Hillbrow Forensics, they're taking the DNA of those that have passed on. At Diepkloof, they're then processing family members. So family members have to come through and give DNA swabs, and then they're matching unique numbers, because right now, obviously the deceased, as they're unidentified, they're John Does, they're just given unique numbers. And once they've matched that, then families will be told your family member has been identified, and that next process of then can we see documentation, and then that release. So it's a lengthy process. That process is also being done by the police services and not by the forensic pathology. So it's a link between the two systems, and we do know we have an issue of DNA backlog in the country, and it's going to take some time.
Certainly the issue of a DNA backlog is something that's been raised for quite some time, over a year now, about the DNA backlog in the country. What we also saw, though, is a lot of politicians in the Johannesburg CBD, many making different statements about, but what I don't seem to get, is there anyone who is taking responsibility? Instead of what we've seen, seems to be a whole lot of shifting the blame. Who should be held responsible for this? Is anyone taking responsibility?
Criselda, we've spoken, as you said, to a multitude of politicians, local government, the metro city of Johannesburg and their leadership. We've spoken to provincial leadership. We had national coming through, with the president coming down to the scene, cancelling his, a briefing that he had for the nation and speaking on this issue at the scene. We had Minister of the Presidencies, but then we also had former leaders of the city of Johannesburg. We had former mayors there. I've spoken to a multitude of them, and while all of them would admit that there is an issue of housing, of hijacked buildings, no one takes the blame. They've moved it. The goalpost constantly moves from it being a metro issue to then provincial leadership having to be accountable to national level, then also bringing in NGOs and the human rights issues. And I think that while we look for who should be held accountable, every single part of this needs to be taken into account when we place blame and accountability. And I think that at this point right now, no one is actually standing up and saying, we made a mistake, or here is where concern should be.
Yeah, absolutely shocking, Hasina, precisely because this is not the first time that the issue of hijacked buildings in the Johannesburg CBD has been raised. It's been raised for years. And also with the instability in terms of leadership in the Johannesburg CBD, very easy for these politicians to shift blame towards each other. Yet you have 76 people who have died, and this could have been avoided.
And I think that is where we right now, that this could have been avoided. The SABC News has covered extensively the issue around the housing concerns, that the hijacked buildings, speaking to local government, but also we've heard of that rehabilitative process of the city from as early as 2014 when Mayor Park Star was in administration. We heard it again when former Mayor Herman Mashaba brought it in December of 2016. We've heard it so many times. We've heard this coalition government bringing in the same issues once again, saying that we have this renewable process that will ensure that we rehabilitate the buildings, but we've not seeing action being done. And yes, they are saying that they've been taken to court due to some of the bylaws. So we need to see those bylaws being shifted, but also bring in the human rights activists in as well, and have a dialogue right now, because blaming and that blame game affects no one but the vulnerable and the poor, and have, like the 76 that we've seen who have lost their lives right now, find themselves in that situation where they're vulnerable, where they're left with no other alternatives but to be exploited and find housing, such as these in poor places with no good sanitation or water.
And in fact, we'll be speaking a bit later, just so that our viewers are aware. We'll also speak to SABC News reporter Patricia Vasahi, who is out at one of the shelters, I understand. We'll touch base with her a little bit later on. But Hasina, the survivors, where are they? And there is also a fear, I understand, that some do not want to be taken to this alternative housing because, for starters, they're illegal in the country.
So that is also a concern. So we've seen some of them, going into those shelters. Some are on the streets. Some have been housed by others that they've found. So family members or, communities that they found. But the issue around fears, and I spoke with the Department of Home Affairs yesterday with the Minister, Arun Motsoaledi, speaking on this, also with families that may want to come and identify their loved ones and feel that they do not have their proper documentation, and he listed quite a few different processes that those that may be in the country could find themselves here legally in, and he said that once they come in, they will first look through that system. And there's even just a letter of origin that they're okay with. That if you have a letter of origin of where you come from, a passport from another country that has a stamp of entry or a visa into the country, if you have asylum seeker papers, refugee papers, those all can assist you. And at this point that they're not looking at whether or not people had broken the law. It is a human rights crisis. It is a disaster right now. What they're more concerned is ensuring that loved ones are reconnected with those that have passed on, that those that need assistance are given assistance, because these are some of the laws that we have enshrined and we're governed by in international laws that we've signed to, so that they've allayed fears that they will not be prosecuting at this point, and that they will assist those that may find themselves illegally in the country if they come forward, and they will find ways for them.
Hasina, leave no stone unturned. Certainly someone needs to take responsibility for what happened in the Johannesburg CBD. What we've seen is a flurry of politicians that have descended over the past 48 hours, if I can say, to the Johannesburg CBD. Lots of blame shifting that's taking place. Very few leadership taking place there, or signs of leadership taking place. Instead, 76 people have now died. The next time we cross to you, you'll be at the Diepkloof mortuary. Just very quickly before I let you go, Hasina, of course, you're headed to the Diepkloof mortuary now, but I guess also where you have to balance your ethics, and the way that you do your job. These are people obviously grieving, who want to identify, their loved ones and perhaps begin the process of burying them, at least those who are not burned beyond recognition and do not have to wait for the DNA process. Talk to us a bit about that.
I think, Christella, this is, one time when you have to remind yourself that these are human beings, that they're going through what could be the worst day of their lives right now, and that they are having to grieve very publicly when we put a camera in front of their face. And I think Media Monitor Africa put out a statement, just urging, journalists and those that are even the politicians to be sensitive. And I think that that's what we try to do, that when we do speak to those, we first ask permission, ask consent, and allow them that opportunity to say that they would not like to be on air or to share their grief. And when they do so, to give them space with grace and dignity, to allow them to share what they can. This is a traumatic incident for them. And if anyone has covered disaster, you know that the first 72 hours, most of them are not even grieving at this point. They're just surviving. They're looking for their basic housing, their basic needs. So we try to cover both sides of it and not just be voyeurs around it or vultures, as we sometimes accused of being, and allow them that space, because some do want to speak. Some feel that this gives them a voice. So we try to allow them to come to us, allow that space. And when they do, to not probe too far in, and hopefully give them that dignity that they deserve during this very trying time.
Hasina, we'll speak to you a little bit later on. Thank you very much indeed for stopping by at the studio first as you go out to continue to cover the story. Hasina Gori, SABC News reporter, covering that story for us.